Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we're learning about the War of 1812 at the Cannonball House in Lewes, Delaware. It's a maritime history lesson you won't soon forget. Stick around, the 302 is sailing your way. When the cannonballs came thick and fast. That's a quote from a newspaper back in 1812 to talk about the War of 1812. But if you want to know exactly what happened, there's no better place to come than the Cannonball House. And I'm joined now by Bill Hicks, who is a volunteer historian. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Well, we're called the Cannonball House because we're the last house standing in Lewes that still bear the scars of the 1813 bombardment by the British. In March of 1813, Commodore John P. Beresford pulled up off of Cape Henlopen with a fleet of ships that included the 74-gun Poitiers, his flagship, the 36-gun Belvidera, the sloop of war La Paz with 24 guns, and an assortment of gun barges. Their intention was to blockade the bay, to keep ships from going up to Philadelphia and to keep the ships in Philadelphia from getting out to the rest of the world. Well, on March 16th, Commodore Beresford writes a letter to the Chief Justice of Lewistown. That would have been Judge Daniel Rodney. And in this letter he says, "Sir, I require 20 live bullocks, cows, and a proportionate amount of vegetables and hay to supply my squadron now at anchor at this place. I'm prepared to pay you Philadelphia prices immediately. But if you fail to comply with my wishes, I will find it necessary to destroy your town. I remain your obedient servant, J.P. Beresford." Well, the people of Lewes sent a letter to the governor saying, "We need a little help down here." The governor mobilized the militia, and within 2 weeks we had soldiers pouring into town from all over the state. They also sent a letter back to Beresford, and in it they basically said, "We're at war with England. We're in the middle of the War of 1812. Trading with you would be treason. You're not getting your cows." So on the morning of April 6th, Commodore Beresford tried to make good on his threat to destroy the town. He unleashed a bombardment that saw 800 cannonballs rain down on the town for a period of 22 hours. Cannonballs ranging in size from 32-pound cannonballs down to 9-pounders. We were hit by a 9-pounder in the foundation. It blasted through the foundation and embedded itself about 3 feet into the ground under the house. It was later excavated and it's in our exhibit now. Well, the Americans, the militia, were in a fort across the street. The guns that you see over there are the guns that were there in 1813. They discovered that the 18-pound cannonballs being fired in by the British fit those guns perfectly.
So they're able to recycle them.
So they sent the young men of the militia across the bridge at Market Street into the marsh. They gathered up all the cannonballs that fell short, brought them back to the fort, and the Americans literally returned fire. David Painter was the commissary officer for the regiment. He noted in his account book after the bombardment, 500 of His Royal Majesty's cannonballs, $0. Well, after the 22 hours, Beresford did cease firing. He had to. He had no justification for it. Lewes wasn't a tactical target. It wasn't a strategic location. It was a sleepy little maritime town that wouldn't give him cows. I don't think the Admiralty would have smiled upon much more expenditures of ammunition for spite. So he did cease firing. The blockade remained out there, though, until September of 1814. It was an 18-month blockade, so it really did shut down the town. Overall, though, the town fared pretty well. There was no loss of life. Injuries were few and far between. And there was about $2,000 in property damage. That would amount to about $2 million today. Every house along this street was damaged in one way or another, as well as buildings up on 2nd Street were as the same. But the people of Lewes, feeling pretty good, sent an article to the Philadelphia newspapers, and in it they talked about the bombardment and how the tiny town of Lewes was attacked by the British Empire and the tiny town won. They concluded it with a rather lengthy poem that read in part, "Commodore Beresford and all his men only wounded a pig and killed a hen. So that's our bombardment story. That's part of the involvement here and during the War of 1812. Like I said, the blockade was out there until September the following year. So the town of Lewes felt those effects all the time. The pilots that lived in this town had no work. They couldn't take ships from Cape Henlopen to Philadelphia and bring them back again. So what they did was they formed an artillery regiment, and they were known as the Pilots Regiment. They were the world's worst soldiers. Good sailors, but the world's worst soldiers. And so the second day of the bombardment, April 7th, Gilbert McCracken, who lived in this house, was a pilot. He was a member of the artillery regiment. And he should have been across the street at those cannon firing back at the British. We know that, I think Judge Rodney estimated that 563 cannonballs came into Lewes that day. But instead, we have Sarah Mariner's daybook from Mariner's Tavern up on 2nd Street. She was open, which is amazing.
Yeah, so she was serving
She's serving drinks during both days during the bombardment.
You're going to have a cocktail, might as well
Exactly. You fortify yourself before you go to the fortifications. Well, you look at the daybook, and Gilbert McCracken is there, and David Johnson is there, and Simon Edwards is there. These are all men that are supposed to be firing cannon. So was it, a little breakfast, toddy? Did they stop for lunch and go to Mariners and get a little bracer? Or was it maybe after the day was done and a hard day on the cannons, you go get a grog? That we don't know, but we do know that indeed they were in there and she was open, which speaks volumes, number one, to the
fortitude.
The fortitude of a woman here in 1813. I mean, women did not run businesses unless their husband died. And then, if they got permission, that's how they could make a living. And so Simon died in 1811. Sarah's running the tavern, and she decided to be open. Now, during the whole blockade, most of the militia officers stayed at Mariners. So we have, again, their records of what they were drinking and what they were eating and the nights they stayed there. So it's a pretty interesting story.
That's fascinating. We're going to come right back and talk more about the history behind the Cannonball House. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Bill Wright from Maxim Escape Rooms, and we love the 302. Let me out!
Welcome back. Now, Bill, I know that the War of 1812 is considered or called sometimes the Forgotten War, but it doesn't seem like here at the Cannonball House that you guys have forgotten anything about this period in history. Just when you come in, the map on the floor and some of the exhibits. Can you tell us a little bit about the two-sided exhibit that you have, the American perspective versus the British perspective?
Yeah, exactly. We call it Breaking Britannia's Grasp. And the War of 1812 is sometimes also called the Second War of Independence. After the Revolutionary War, America just didn't have the recognition that it should have had as a world player. England just tried to ignore us. We were a hindrance, a bother, and yeah, they lost, but they just didn't want anything to do with us. And so that made itself evident in trade. That made itself evident in treaties with other countries. And so James Madison declared war in 1812 with the express purpose of ending impressment, which was a practice by the British Navy where basically they would kidnap sailors. You might be a sailor in a tavern on a dock somewhere, anywhere in the world, and you'd wake up the next morning and you're on a British ship and you're now a British sailor for at least the next 3 years. And so impressment was a problem. Thousands of men were pressed into service. The ships would have what they called press gangs, and they would walk with, we have a persuader in there, which is a bit of a club, and with a quick knock up against the side of the head, you'd go down, and like I said, the next morning, you're now a British sailor. So we look at that, and those are sort of the reasons behind it. But really what Madison wanted was standing in the world. And he got that after this war. I think at the time, England was far too involved with France. They were in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and so to have another war come up, we were an annoyance. So they immediately went into negotiations to try and end this thing right from the very beginning. But here in Lewes, you know, we had this blockade out there that lasted 18 months. It affected us, you know, personally. Pilots could not work. You could not get goods in or out. There were raids. Commodore Beresford, the commander of the British fleet out there, wanted to get water. And so he sent some longboats full of Marines, armed Marines, into what is now Silver Lake down in Rehoboth. It was known as Newbold's Pond back then. And it was known around the world as a fresh water source close to the beach. In fact, it was just on the other side of the dunes. So ships would drop anchor off of Rehoboth, row in, cross the beach, cross the dune, and you could get all the fresh water you wanted. Well, Beresford tried to do it, and he was met with a militia force of about 100 men each time that would drive his Marines back to the ship. So they never got their fresh water here. They never got their cows here, even though he wanted to buy them. So he ended up going up to Cedar Creek, which is about 10 miles up the bay. And he raided farms and stole the cattle that he needed to feed his men. As far as exhibits here in the museum, we do look at both sides. We give you a British viewpoint. Life on board a British ship was harsh, but the British sailors were well trained, even if they were impressed. You know, they had a job to do. They had their regulations to follow. They had all of their rules that were listed and all of their watches, and they knew what to do. Here we had Gilbert McCracken and pilots and farmers and merchants forming the militia. So training-wise, the British were far better prepared for battle than the folks here in Lewes. We got lucky. During the bombardment, we know that we damaged at least 2 of the gun barges. Well, they had to retire from battle, and they went across the bay to Cape May because the folks in Cape May were a little more amenable to dealing with the British than the patriotic people here in Lewes were. Also, that's where Beresford did some trading to get his supplies. You look at British sailors again, and they were known as Jack Tars. And that's not... that's for a couple reasons. All sailors are known as tars. When you're on board a sailing ship, every line, every rope, every crack, every crevice is covered with coal tar and filled with tar to make it waterproof, to make it water resistant. And so a sailor, you know, was always covered with tar. So every sailor was a tar. Now the British became known as Jack Tars because the British flag is known as the Union Jack. And so you were sailing under the Union Jack, you were a Jack Tar. It was not uncommon for African Americans to be sailors in the British Royal Navy. It was a job. There was pay there. It was,
you got your freedom.
You got your freedom. Here in the United States, again, British captains were always looking to entice slaves to run away, come on board ship and become a British sailor. We know of at least 2 here in Lewes that did that. They made their escape. They rowed out to the Poitiers, and then they became involved in a prisoner exchange between a Lieutenant Phillips. Somehow Lieutenant Phillips from the Belvidera got himself captured here in Lewes on land. And so the two runaway slaves became the negotiating tool that if you want Phillips back, you've got to return the slaves to their enslaver. Well, that didn't happen. Phillips eventually got back to the ship, but the slaves remained on board the Poitiers, as far as I know, and became British sailors. Now, this museum is more than just the War of 1812. Upstairs, that's what we look at. Downstairs, we look at piloting. Lewes has been a home to pilots since the early 1700s. Now,
sure.
A pilot is a person that takes a ship from Cape Henlopen to Philadelphia and brings it back again. Sure. Every ship that travels on the bay must have a pilot on board.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that and also about tattoos and even ghosts here at the Cannonball House. We'll be right back.
Tim Slavin from the Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs here in Delaware helped preserve history with the 302.
Welcome back. We're learning all about the War of 1812 and the bombardment of Lewes in 1813 here at the Cannonball House. Bill, there is so much here when you come. There's such a wide swath of history. You can even see things like tattoos. Is that right?
Exactly. Up here in our British sailor below decks room, we have a hand and an arm displaying tattoos that British sailors might have had in the early 19th century. Traditionally, 2 dots on the middle finger, on the first knuckle of the middle finger, or in the webbing between forefinger and thumb, was an indication that this was your first voyage, and that was often the first tattoo that British sailors got. As they made their way around the world, they adorned their body with more and more art. Now, this wasn't done in the tattoo parlors of today with hygienic conditions. This was a sharp needle and ink and a talented artist to do that. So we do look at that. We look at the sleeping accommodations of the British sailors. Traditionally, the bunks, the hammocks were stacked 3 deep, 18 inches apart. But you wouldn't have 3 men sleeping all at the same time. One man might be sleeping, another might be on watch already, another may have just come off his watch. So you might have 1 of the 3 hammocks filled at any one time. Other things in the museum we look at, we were talking about pilots and Lewes being a home to pilots. So we have an extensive exhibit there ranging from the 1800s all the way up to about 2000, I think, is our latest exhibit down there, our latest artifact down there. Our middle room looks at the menhaden fishing industry. Menhaden is a bony, oily, inedible fish that's harvested for its oil. It was used as a replacement for whale oil in the 1800s. Well, from 1880 to 1966, when the menhaden were finally commercially fished out, Lewes always had 2 fish factories up on the other side of where the ferry terminal sits. The smell was horrible. You couldn't go on the beach when the wind was from the east, but the locals called it the smell of money because in its heyday, the fish factories employed up to 650 people. In 1953, Lewes was the #1 fishing port in the United States by tonnage, just because they brought in so many menhaden. And they were also a large employer of our African American community. And from the very beginning in the 1800s, it was always an integrated industry, both in the factory and on the fleets. So we give that nod to that community because they played such an integral part in making Lewes what it is today. We have on our complex, we have a net reel, a menhaden net reel. And its purpose is just to dry the nets. Menhaden nets were about 1,200 feet long. And so the boats would come in at the end of the day, they'd hook a reel, net onto a reel. 4 men would climb into the reel like a hamster wheel, and they would start to walk. And as they walked, they would sing shanties to keep themselves in time, to keep everything in sync. And they would wind the net up so it could dry. They would stop when it needed to be repaired, and then continue to do that. So it's an important part of Lewes history. It's an important part of our African American heritage here in town. Our last room looks at the breakwaters, those long stone walls you see out in the bay. The inner wall was authorized by President John Quincy Adams in 1826. Most people don't know that. They see the walls and think, they've been out there since the 40s. No, it's almost 200 years ago. The outer wall, built in 1890. And they are the location of our 2 remaining lighthouses here in Lewes.
But in addition to history about the bombardment, there's also a little ghost story that goes along with the building.
Exactly.
Tell us about that.
And that's almost modern history. Back in 1869, Susan King married Captain David Roland. Captain Roland was a pilot. And so he was 70 years old. It was his second marriage. She was 30 years old in her first marriage. They had one son. He survived 5 years and passed away, leaving a very young widow at 35. So to make ends meet, she ran a fabric shop, buttons and bows and notions. And she operated that out of one room, and she lived in the room in the back. Well, when she was 89, March 20th in 1917, she had just finished polishing her coal stove. And she used a stove black that was flammable. It ignited, she ignited, and 89-year-old Susan Roland burned to death. A tragic story. I mean, she was well known. Everybody came to Aunt Susan's shop. And so it was a tragic story. Well, we fast forward now to about 1961 when the society purchased the house. We had a handyman here that was fixing everything up. The house had fallen into great disrepair by then. So he was here every single day. And he'd finish up at the end of the day and leave his tools scattered around. And the next morning he'd come in and the tools would all be neatened up and straightened out. And this went on for a while, and finally he said to the docents, ladies, you don't have to put my tools away. You don't have to organize them. And they said, well, Fred, we didn't do that. And eventually he started putting his own tools away. Well, a little time goes by and they come to him and say, Fred, we're having trouble keeping this door open. We have a door that goes up to a loft, an unfinished loft. And he said, oh, okay, well, that's not a problem. So he took 4 nails, 1, 2, 3, 4 nails, nailed the door closed. They put a poster up on the door. Life was good until the next morning. They came in, the poster was rolled up sitting in the corner, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4 nails across the floor, and the door is open. So Fred said, okay, well, we can fix that. 1, 2, 3, 4 nails in the door again, poster back up on the door, and the next morning, the poster's rolled up, the door is open, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4 nails across the floor. So Fred's thinking, well, maybe these ladies are playing a trick on me. He says, I'll fix this so this door never opens again. And he put 1, 2, 3, 4 screws in the door. Poster back up. Next morning, poster's rolled up in the corner. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 nails across, or screws across the floor, and the door is open. They let it go after that and just shut the door when they had to. Fast forward again to about 1996, we had a group of ghost hunters here, a professional group. They had all the ghost hunter equipment that you could think of. And so they determined that indeed we had a female spirit here and that it was Susan Roland. And that she was a very friendly spirit. She liked people coming to her house, so she was a ghostess with the mostest. But she liked to keep a neat house. And you know, when you burn a coal stove, it gives off fumes. But if you leave that loft door cracked open, it creates a natural draft, a chimney effect that pulls the air out of the room up to the loft, making the air in the room much fresher. So every night when I leave here at 4 o'clock, I make sure the door is shut and I say, good night, Susan, and lock the door. So that's our ghost story as well.
Well, it's fascinating, as is everything that you've shared with us today. Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll be right back. For more information on the Cannonball House, you can visit historiclewes.org. That'll do it for this week's episode. We leave you now with some beauty shots of Lewes Harbor. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on the 302.